Well, good morning, everybody. It's a very special welcome to our campus in Kernersville. Everybody at Union Cross campus, good morning to you guys. God bless you. And to everyone in Clemens this morning, God blessing to you. And how happy I am to say and welcome and good morning to everyone at the Stokes Family YMCA in King. We are so glad that you're with us, and I'm so happy to be with you this morning. I want you to know, if you're new with us, we start every message by asking, are you ready for some good news? And it's not a rhetorical question. It is one that we need you to call out and say, yes, if indeed you do want to have some good news. Are you ready for some good news? Yes. You can live a worry-free life. Now, note well, I did not say you can live a problem-free life. You can live without worries about your problems. And when you do, you'll actually have more courage, energy, and clarity about how to address those problems. I read about a man who was a real worrier, and he decided he'd try something kind of radical. And it worked. All of a sudden, he didn't seem like he was worrying very much. And a friend asked him, said, "What have you done?" He said, "Well, I paid somebody to worry for me." The friend said, "Well, you're kidding. How much did you pay him?" He says, "Well, it's $1,000 a week." The friend said, $1,000 a week? How are you able to afford $1,000 a week? The man said, "Well, that's for him to worry about." I wish I could say that the worry-free life meant that you didn't have to work anymore or be responsible anymore. No, that's not at all what it means. It means instead, for all of those negative what-ifs, what if the worst happens, and how that plays out in your mind, it means for those to end, and instead, a new set of godly, hopeful what-ifs that begin to fill your whole imagination. It is like having your imagination that in our sin nature is bent towards the negative becomes sanctified, and you see with God's eyes. People say, well, how do you know where to launch a new campus? We're a multi-campus church, one church meeting in multiple locations, and we're so excited to be starting King today. How do you know? Well, is it just prayer? Is there a strategy involved? Till this point, church leadership has kept it quite secret, but I'm going to give you today the big reveal of this. We first were in Kernersville, and then in Clemens, and now in King. What do these three communities all have in common? Dario. Yes, that's it. Dario. We got Dario in Kernersville, which is about 4 miles from where we meet at Glen High School. But I must say, Pastor Barrett and his family live within about a mile of the Dario in Kernersville. And then we went to Clemens, and the Dario there is only 0.6 miles away from the YMCA, the Jerry Long YMCA. And now in King, you can be proud because it is the original Dario. So we're kind of scoping out, I think Dario's going to Archdale, and they've just gone to Ashboro. So we've got some other potential campus locations. I guess, the Old Testament, they were led by the pillar of fire during the day, the pillar of cloud during the day, pillar of fire at night. For us, we're led by the 2 hot dog combo, I guess it is. No, seriously, here's what happened. So Pastor Chris, our executive pastor, he grew up in King, and we have a lot of our church members that live in the King area, and so we began praying about it. And one day I went up with Pastor Chris, and he drove me around. And he was proud to drive around and show me where he grew up and where his family lived and his grandmother's house. And we looked at the schools, and we looked at the recreation acres, and we drove up by Camp Haynes, and we stopped by for hot dogs at Dario, and then we drove around and looked at other churches, prayed for them, thought about. And while we were just driving around, what was happening was I began to see things. I began to imagine what it would be like for people in that area who had maybe grown tired of religion and yet had not given up on God. People who might want a fresh start in their life. People who maybe had once fellowshiped with the church and had fallen away. I began to think about a conversation I had with one of our members who was on staff at the Y, who said that the opioid epidemic that has taken over our country at such terrible proportions has not bypassed King, and how young people have been tempted by meth and other drugs as well as the opioids. And I began to imagine young people being set on a different path, and those that are being set free from the shame that fuels so much of our addiction. And I began to envision and imagine families that could have a place where they would hear the gospel in a fresh way, and because there was something new that was starting, that they could come and find a place where they could raise their kids and let them grow up in the knowledge of the love of the Lord Jesus. And I just began to envision all of that. You see, what is that that's happening with that? That's imagination. It is this uniquely human capacity to envision that which does not exist but can. Animals can't do that. But we who were made in the image of God have a faculty by which we can look into the invisible. It's because this is the nature of God. He imagined all of this world and He spoke it into existence. It's a uniquely human thing to be able to imagine. Only human beings could have taken their experience in the bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, and imagined that there could be a heavier-than-air aircraft that was propelled by a motor and had a 3-axis control steering mechanism that a human being could steer and fly it through the air. And when Orville and Wilbur Wright went off for about a few hundred yards, it wasn't really the stiff December wind in their face that made them lift. It was their imagination. They couldn't have pictured that not much more than 100 years later there would be the North American X-15 jet propelled by rockets that can travel over 5,000 miles per hour. But their imagination started it all. Only a human being could decide to buy up 30,000 acres of cattle and swampland in the middle of central Florida because he said he wanted to build the happiest place on earth. And even Walt Disney's imagination might not have stretched to envision that now 52 million people a year from around the world come to Disney World, the most visited resort in the world. Only a human being made in the image of God could stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on a hot August day of 1963 and speak to 250,000 people and say, in the middle of dire racial inequality, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Imagination can bring to life what it has conceived of. Oh, it's not to say oversimplistically that you just think of some purple, pink, polka-dotted elephant and you make one, but it is to say that every wonderful thing that has been invented in art and beauty and all of it is, as God made us, something that comes through our imagination. Imagination is exceedingly powerful. And so what's happened is that imagination that God gave us and made us to have somewhere deep in our heart, when sin came into the world, it became corrupted. And instead of seeing all of the what-ifs of how beautiful and how wonderful it can be, our what-ifs began to be corrupted into all the negatives. And here's the thing about it, is that if our imagination of something wonderful, whether it be a plane or Disney World or a civil rights movement, could be envisioned by a sanctified imagination, then how much terrible pain comes into our lives and into the world by worry. Maybe it's the reason, therefore, that the most common command in Scripture is do not be afraid. Over 300 times in one way or another it says do not fear, do not be afraid, do not worry about anything. I want to start today and spend weeks on this, the life of no worries that is possible when Jesus sanctifies our imagination. And I can't think of a better place to start than to see the contrast between two generations that were both promised a land and only the second generation that took it. Abraham was promised he would be a father, and he was promised that he would be the father of a nation and that he would be given a land. And the people of God, they were put into great bondage in Egypt. They went through horrific years of slavery, and they were set free because God used a mediator named Moses who went between God and the people and between the people and Pharaoh. The mediator Moses spoke the word of God to the people, and when they had a revelation of applying the blood of an innocent lamb over their doorposts, then the destroyer came through, and all the firstborns in Egypt were slain, but the Hebrew people were set free, and that deliverance, that exodus, was only the beginning. Because what God had intended all along was that they were going to go into that land that had been promised to Abraham. And so the story of the people becomes, will they take the land or will they not? And we pick up today reading about this in Numbers chapter 13 at verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, that's the promised land, which I'm giving to the people of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them. So there are 12 tribes, and they're going to send out 12 spies to go into the promised land. And why were they going in to spy it out? We get some clarity at verse 17. Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, go up into the Negeb and go into the hill country and see what the land is, and whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, whether they're few or many, and whether the land they dwell in is good or bad, and whether the cities that they dwell in are camps or strongholds, and whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not. Be of good courage and bring some of the fruit of the land. It was the time of the season of the first ripe grapes. So there were really two reasons they were supposed to go into the land. They're supposed to go and spy it out and bring back an accurate assessment so that they would know what the challenges are in front of them. And that's an important part of wise living, is to be aware of what you're signing up for. But then he said, and this was the more important part, bring back some of the fruit. Go into the land that is flowing with milk and honey and bring back some evidence of it. And you know why I think God wanted them to do this? Was he wanted them to go in and bring back the biggest grapes they'd ever seen, the sweetest pomegranates, and have the people taste it and start imagining life in a land flowing with milk and honey. That's what he wanted them to do. But what happened was at the end of this, the report that came back was fearful. Numbers 13, verse 25. At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land, and they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and all the congregation. They sowed them through the land, so they did that. And they told them, we came into the land which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. So, to be a worrier doesn't mean that you don't at times acknowledge good things. It's not so much that every one of our thoughts is consumed by worry. It's that our worries ruin the bliss of all our other thoughts. And so this is what happened with them. They said, yeah, it's flowing with milk and honey. Here's some of the fruit. But no sooner had they given them the fruit than the negativity began, the worries began. Verse 28, however, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Well, Anak, scholars think, probably was a real people that had an ancestry and had a reputation of being very fierce warriors. So there very well may have been some descendants from this fierce warrior clan of Anak. So the report, they come back, they're emphasizing, but here's some fruit. Okay, but while you're eating the grapes, let me tell you about the fierce warrior clan that we saw. But then they start ramping it up. This is what worry does, isn't it? They ramp up their negative report with exaggeration. This is what worry does. So at verse 30, Caleb quieted the people before Moses, and he said, let's go up at once and occupy it, for we're well able to overcome it. Caleb and Joshua, as we'll see later, the only two of the spies that said, no, we should go take it. But the majority report then, the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people. They're stronger than we are. So they brought the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they'd spied out, saying the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, meaning the land is too rough and you can't survive on it, or that anybody that's new is overtaken. They weren't even there long enough to see anybody being devoured. And then they said, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. All of them. The whole place. Everybody in there is of great height. And it just gets even ramped up from there. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. Well, the Nephilim were a mythical breed that had supposedly been before Noah, of the union of angels and men, and it was sort of this mythical half God, half human creature that's enormous. And they said, we saw them there. No, they didn't. And they said, we seem like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we seem to them. So the worry now has expanded to being able to become mind readers. These are some advanced worriers here. You know, there are different levels of worriers. There are the beginning warriors. Beginning worriers are those that, don't worry that much. They just haven't gained the skill of meditating on the bad things. If you're going to really become a good worrier, you can't just have darting thoughts come in there. You got to practice this. It takes some work and meditation. A beginning worrier is kind of like, years ago, when I was serving a church in Durham, I had a little Toyota Corolla. And one day I was waiting to turn into the church. It's a left-hand turn in on just a little two-lane, two-way traffic road that says 45-mile-an-hour speed limit. And oncoming traffic this way, I couldn't turn in, so I'm having to wait to turn in. I looked in my rearview mirror, and I saw somebody just flying down. There's a ditch on my right, traffic come on the left, and nothing I can do except just wait to be hit. And I got smacked in the rear end, whiplash and everything. And the poor little Corolla, you can imagine. Well, for weeks, if not months after that, maybe even smattering over years, what am I doing? I'm always looking in the rearview mirror like, when's the next one going to come hit me? But over time, I realized that doesn't happen that often. And in fact, it's never happened again, and that was probably 28 years ago. So I quit worrying about that. That's a beginning worrier. See, no skill at all in meditating on these things. You got to generalize this if you're going to be a more advanced worrier. So I'd say that's the beginning worriers, but then you got your intermediate worriers, and these are ones that you've gained some skills on getting it more glorified. You can play out negative scenarios. Intermediate worrying would be like what I was doing when the University of North Carolina Tar Heel football team was playing football last week against South Carolina, and my poor Tar Heels have only won 2 games each of the last 2 seasons, and it's just been terrible because many games we had in hand and lost it in the fourth quarter. Carolina had been so creative over the last few years of losing in the fourth quarter. I almost felt like they were inventing ways to lose it in the fourth quarter, and then they had the lead on South Carolina. They had scored 15 unanswered points, in the fourth quarter and had a 4-point lead and had the ball with just a little bit of time left. And so all you do at this point is you take care of the football and you try to run so a little bit of time off the clock, and you make sure that you don't make any mistakes. And so I'm a nervous wreck because I'm like, I know there's only a couple minutes left in this game, but they use the clock well. South Carolina uses up their timeouts, and it gets down to fourth down. North Carolina's at midfield, fourth down, and there's about 12 seconds left in the game. And by some coaching glitch or huge mistake, the quarterback takes the snap and then takes a knee. So now there's 10 or 12 seconds left in the game, and it's South Carolina's ball at midfield. Now, this is where my intermediate skills of worrying kicked in. I have watched us in all these creative ways lose, and so I already had it figured out in my mind. Here's what's going to happen. They're going to run back, they're going to throw a pass, and I already knew how we were going to get defensive interference called on us. The guy was going to get an extra step on us. Our guy's going to be running. Instead of turning around and make a play on the ball, run into the guy, flag's thrown. Now they're going to have the ball down closer thing, and they're going to have a chance with about 5 seconds left to throw in the end zone. It's going to bobble around. This is the way I saw it in my worrying. They bobble around. South Carolina player falls to the ground. It falls down, hits him in the number. He catches touchdown. They win. I had it all figured out in my mind. Now, that's a pretty good worrying there. Carolina won, by the way. It just got away with their mistakes at the very end. But then there is like these guys, these spies in Canaan. This is what I would call the advanced worrier. Highly skilled at thinking far in advance of not only the negative thing that could happen, but also imagining the concentric circles that could come around it, and how many scenarios that are negative could be played out. Ann had a dear old uncle named Max who was a very advanced, skilled worrier, one of the best. And he managed a department store in Spruce Pine, North Carolina, and everybody knew he would go and we'd shut it down at night, and he'd lock it and he'd check it, walk to his car, he'd come back over and he'd check the lock again, go back to his car, walk back a third time, check it again. And they said that he would do this sometimes as much as 5 times, go home and say, I need to drive back over and make sure I locked the door. This was Uncle Max, but it took the cake. When this is a true story, Uncle Max had to take his car, drive it in to the shop. The car wasn't in bad shape. He was just driving it to the shop, some kind of repair. And so he called Ann's uncle, Charlie, who lived in Spruce Pine. He said, would you follow me to the mechanic in your car in case my car breaks down on the way to the mechanic? Then you would be following me, and that way I could get a ride from you if my car breaks down on the way to the shop. And Charlie said, well, Max, your car's not going to break down, but okay, I'll follow you. So Charlie agreed to follow him. And then next thing you know, Ann's uncle Stanley got a call from Uncle Max. And Max said, Stanley said, Charlie is going to follow me as I drive my car to the shop. But if my car breaks down and then I get in with Charlie, if Charlie's car breaks down, then what will we do? So will you follow in your vehicle Charlie while Charlie follows me? And Uncle Stan said, no, I will not do that. Will not do that. Advanced warriors are marked by an amazing ability to bring other people into their tent of worry. Chapter 14, verse 1, all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. All the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we died in the land of Egypt, or would that we died in this wilderness. Worry is a contagious thing. This is a true story. I had one of the happiest days of my life, something that is a once-in-a-lifetime thing that I got to do years ago. I think Bennett was 10 or 11, and we were in the Bahamas, and we were going to splurge, spend the money, and go swimming with dolphins. So little Bennett and I were going to go swim. Ann and Abby weren't going to, but I was so looking forward to it. I mean, how fun is that going to be? And so we're sitting on the dock waiting for the boat that was going to take us to the place where we swim with the dolphins, and a stranger came in and sat down next to me. And he started a conversation with me, and he said, well, what are you getting ready to do? I said, I'm getting ready to go swim with dolphins. And he said, he said, oh no, I said, what? He said, most people don't know it, but dolphins bite. I said, dolphins bite? He said, yeah, most people don't know that. They got teeth and they bite. I said, you're kidding? He said, no, and they'll ram you too. I said, people, they think that dolphins are friendly, but he said, I don't know if I'd do that if I was you. And I was like, oh, man, I started getting nervous and worried about it. And all of a sudden, it was like this light turned on me. I said, no. I got up and I walked away and said, no, the dolphin's the most lovable creature in the world. I'm going to go swim with some dolphins. If you can start making somebody worried about how mean a dolphin is, you can make them worried about anything. That's some advanced worrying right there. Ed Welch, counselor and author, said these spies weren't just pessimistic, they were false prophets. They spoke of a future as if they knew, and they didn't. It goes far to explain why, when our text said they brought a bad report, the actual Hebrew word means an evil report, a wicked report. It was wicked in God's eyes. Destruction comes when there is chronic worry, because if you have ungodly beliefs that are grounded in worry, you can't get past them. I like the way the best-selling author Michael Hyatt described this using the illustration of one of those invisible fences that you have for a dog. And the dog wears a collar during a training period, and it gives them some kind of unpleasant buzz every time they get around that, or a little shock, or whatever it does. And they learn where the boundaries of that is, and the dog won't go. And then you can take the collar off of the dog, and they'll walk right up to the edge. You can stand on the other side of that invisible boundary, give them a treat, anything else, and they won't go across it because they're so worried about the unpleasant experience of that, even though there's no collar left and there is no unpleasant experience that they will. And that's kind of the way our ungodly beliefs and our worries, in a sense, once you have decided through worry of what the limit is, you don't go past it. But there's more than that that's going on with it. There's a kind of expectation, because when you predict something, even if it was something bad, there's a little part of you that sort of wants it to come true, just to prove you right. Have you ever noticed this? That worry is so painful that sometimes the worry is worse than the actual, when the problem that you worried about maybe does happen, the worry you find was worse. I knew one worrier in the church I served in Durham. She was a sweet lady, but she was just a worrier all the time. And she was worried in a hypochondriac type way about being sick, and worried about everything she felt in her body, everything. Always talking about it, and always talking about, well, I probably need to go to the doctor about this, and she's always worried about some diagnosis, but she didn't have any bad diagnosis. And this went on for years and years. And one day, I went to visit her, and she said, well, it's finally happened. And she had gotten a pretty bad diagnosis about something, not a mortal diagnosis, but it was a pretty bad health problem. And y'all, she was plumb giddy. It was the happiest I'd ever seen her. She was like on cloud nine. I was like, you just got the worst medical news you've got in your whole life. And she was just happy. It's something inside of you that is almost leaning in towards the thing you worry about. But there's even something more to say to this. And that is, you hear me talk about this often. Worry leads you towards the thing you worry about. I've always illustrated, said, if you were to put a plank of wood on the floor and say, Alan, could you walk across that, maybe a 12-inch wide plank, and I could walk across it backwards. I could probably hop on one foot across it on the floor. But if you would raise it up 100 stories in the air, There is in the Willis Tower in Chicago a glass ledge that you can go and stand on 113 floors above the street below you. the highest building in the Western Hemisphere, and you step out of the building onto this glass ledge, and I've done it. And I'll tell you what I felt when I stepped on it and looked down. I couldn't breathe. And all I could think about was getting back, even though it was clearly, from an engineering standpoint, perfectly safe. Just the thought of looking down at that. And if you put a board up 113 floors high and said, can you walk across the same board you walk on the floor? I'd say, no way. And the fact of the matter is, it wouldn't be just that I felt limited by that worry, but as soon as I stepped on it and I'm 113 floors above the street below me, that worry is going to take my breath away, my heart's going to beat, I'm going to lose my senses of balance, and I'll be way more likely to fall. So the irony, the painful irony of this story of the people is that they went into the land for 40 days to spy out the land, in order to imagine all that could be, and came back with a negative report, and they died in the wilderness. And here was the irony, Numbers 14, verse 34, according to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure, said the Lord. They wandered 40 years in the wilderness. Here's what I'm saying. That land that they were promised by God was their inheritance. And there was only one major worry they had, and that is, we won't get the promised land, and instead we'll die. But do you know the only thing that could keep them from getting the promised land and dying instead was their worry that they wouldn't get the land and they would die. And in their worry, they turned back into the wilderness, and they didn't get the land and they died. What I'm saying is, if you could understand how powerful the imagination is that can create aircraft, world resorts, whole movements in society, that imagination that's so powerful, when it is corrupted by the sin nature, is powerful in the wrong direction. And what God wants to do, and I'm convinced this is the answer for our worries, He wants to take that imagination, and instead of quietening it down and saying, that's your problem, you're too imaginative, that's your worry problem, instead, He wants to light it on fire in a holy way. There's a show I love called Shark Tank. I don't know if anybody likes Shark Tank. I just love Shark Tank. I don't know why I like Shark Tank. Entrepreneurs come on and pitch these inventions that they have to these business tycoons that they're trying to get them to invest their money in their company and help them make it a big success. And I don't know, I love Shark Tank. It's the imagination of just seeing the things that people think up. Now, there have been some weird pitches on there in the pilot program. There was somebody that came on and said, you know, the Bluetooth earbuds that you wear in your ears to listen to your music without wires, he said those things move around too much. And so he had proposed putting a Bluetooth device surgically inside the ear, and then at night using a toothpick type charger that you put in there and plug it in. None of the sharks went for that. There have been all kinds of things. I was watching an episode the other night, I think it was from season 6 or something, and out walked two men, and one of them was famous singer Pat Boone in his 80s, and he was out there pitching a car that runs on air. And one of the business tycoons said he would agree to give him $5 million to try to build this car that runs on air. I'm not sure what's happened with that thing. I just find it fascinating. So it's so imaginative, but it's fascinating also because what happens is they come and they pitch their idea. And then these experienced business people who've made so much money because they're smart, they start asking them questions. How much does it cost you to make it? How much do you sell it for? What is your customer acquisition costs? Tell me about who's working with you now. I want to learn about your own work ethic. They start asking them all these questions and analyzing how much they think the company is worth based on what they're asking for their investment. How are you doing? They bring reason to it. And sometimes with their reasoning, they just say, this is ridiculous, and off the person goes. And sometimes they say, you got a good idea, and we're going to bring reason to this and put it together. So when imagination and reason come together, it's explosive. In many ways, this is the way that C.S. Lewis came to faith. He was an atheist. C.S. Lewis, author of Mere Christianity and all the Chronicles of Narnia. And C.S. Lewis was an imaginative person, but when he was an atheist, he wrote this about that time. He said, of that time, such then was the state of my imaginative life. Over against it stood the life of my intellect. He just saw the imagination and the intellect in opposition to one another. He said, the two hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On the one side is a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Listen to this statement. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary, and nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. What he thought was, everything I love, everything, beauty and art and music and story and myth and imaginative worlds, everything that makes me feel alive, C.S. Lewis was saying, I thought was just imaginary and not real. And everything that I thought was real, that I could understand with my reason, I found to be boring. But he began to consider, what if the things that the imagination conceives of, heaven, a God-man, wonder if it's possible that the things that you can imagine might be as real or more real than some of the things the reason can understand. And he began to realize that the reason he was so full of life when he imagined these things is that he was made for that. And that his dreams needed to just be bigger. And when all this came together for him, he became a Christian and then one of the most brilliant who could write the most rational, reasonable explanation of Christianity, Mere Christianity. And yet also write the Chronicles of Narnia about a magical land where children are kings and queens. Because he understood this now, imagination and reason do not have to conflict, but they can work together. Here's what I mean. In one sense, when Orville and Wilbur Wright imagined a plane flying through the air, even though no one had done this, it was so unreasonable that after they had had some successful flights, they began to try to market it, and they first went to the United States military, who completely rejected it and offered zero contract, and so they went to France to start trying to work for a contract there. In other words, the entire United States military said, that is ridiculous, and we're not going to put a single dollar into that. But the Wright brothers, in their imagination, they were a hold of something more real than the reasonableness of the entire military of the United States. Who was more accurate about what would be, you see? And what Jesus wants to do is take our imagination and make it right again. And make it holy. That's what it means to sanctify. Set it apart to God. Take your imagination and make it alive unto God. Well, it's all typified in this, that after that generation died off, then Joshua, one of the two spies who was positive, he is authorized by God to go and take the land. Joshua chapter 1, verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. That generation is over, and now you're the man, Joshua. Now therefore, arise, the Lord said, go over this Jordan, you and all the people, into the land that I'm giving to them, to the people of Israel, every place that you set the sole of your foot, I have given to you. And he said, verse 8, the book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that's written in it. And so Joshua takes God at his word, imagines taking over the land. He remembers the land that was flowing with milk and honey, and he shares it with the people. And he says at verse 15, till the Lord gives rest to your brothers as he has to you, and they also take possession of the land that your Lord God is giving them, then you shall return to the land of your possession and shall possess it, the land. And listen to all of this incredible imaginative report that Joshua has, and the people said, we're going to do everything that you have commanded us. Interestingly, the name Joshua is the same name as the name Jesus. Yeshua is just transliterated into Jesus in Greek, which we say Jesus, because Jesus is the true Joshua. And when he came, he lit everyone's imagination on fire. Everywhere he went, he'd say, imagine with me, a sower went out to sow some seed, and some of it found fertile ground. Imagine with me a mountain being hurled into the sea. Imagine, if you would, a father had 2 sons, and one of them spent all of his inheritance in wild living, and the father ran to meet him when he came home. Imagine a king who threw a great banquet. What was he doing? He was speaking in parable and metaphor and story, because he was saying, I came to take all of your worries and instead redirect them by a holy imagination to what can be, so that you would see that it is possible that a God-man could come and take your sin. Because in the end, to be a Christian is to imagine this. The Son of God, the Son of Man, went to a cross and became your sin. Imagine it. So that his righteousness could be given to you, and you would become a child of God. Imagine that. That's the gospel.